It is the 1st of February today when I'm filming this, which means it is time for a reset. We're going to start by chatting about how my reading went in January, taking a look at my TBR and some of the goals I had. Did I achieve them? We'll do a brief wrap up of all of the books that I read in January, and then we will head over to my shelf and take a look at my plans, my video plans for February, and what books I'm going to read in February. So let's start with my January stats. Just like last year, I am using the Google Sheets spreadsheet from Hardback Hoarder, which I'll leave a link to in the description box below. In January, I logged reading 24 books, although I DNF'd 3 of those. So I completed 21. I read a total of 5,531 pages. My average rating, I'm actually really thrilled about this, it was 4. A nice neat 4. That's so high for me. I think that average rating was certainly helped by the fact that I did decide to DNF 3 books. There were only 3 books that I finished this month that I rated a 3-star or lower, which means that the vast majority of books that I finished this month I either liked or I loved, which is a really nice feeling. The genre that I read the most of in January was fantasy with 7 books. Some other genres I read were memoir, science fiction, mystery, lit fic, some historical, and a couple of anthologies as well. I read 4 graphic novels, 3 novellas, and 2 poetry collections. 19 of the books that I read this month come from my own TBR, so that's books that I owned before the beginning of this year, which is obviously one of my big goals for the year, is to read more of my own TBR, so I'm happy with that. The rest of the books came from either the library or I bought them at work. Now, in terms of the audience or the age range, 15 of the books, so the majority, were adult books. Then I have 4 YA, 4 middle grade, and 1 children's. 19 of the 24 books that I logged, I classed as diverse reads in some way, which is 79% of my reading. So that is definitely kind of like the ballpark of where I want to be. When I say in some way, I mean in some meaningful way. If there's just some like random side character who, like they mention, is queer or something, I'm not counting that. I mean in some meaningful way. 5 of the books that I logged were non-fiction, which means that 21% of my reading was non-fiction this month. Now, how did I go reading my TBR that I set myself for January? Well, one thing I learned is that I need to be more realistic about like when the book is getting released, if it's a new release. I have historically not been great at like reading a book as soon as it comes into my home, and so that means that I didn't read any of the new releases that I kind of intended to read this month. The first one was Mammoths at the Gates by Nevo, which like I still don't own, so of course I have not yet read. I did though manage to get to the 3rd book in preparation, so I have read Into the Riverlands, which is in our stack and we'll talk about later. Another new release book that I was excited about and I did actually purchase yesterday, it just came in, is Behind You is the Sea, and I just love this cover, but I mean, I purchased it yesterday, so no, I haven't read it yet. The other new release I was interested in was the 3rd book in the Miss Mary Kate Martin's Guide to Monsters series by Karen Foxley. It's one of my favorite junior middle grade series, and I did borrow that book from work, but I just had so many other things to read that I didn't finish it. So I haven't classed that as a DNF. I didn't even log it because I didn't get very far in, and I hope to return to it later in the year. Maybe in middle grade March or something. One of the other books that I had on my list was Light in Gaza, which is my Blossom Book Club's book for January, and I haven't finished it. I have started it. I'm about halfway through. Our live chat is going to be on Monday, so I have a few more days to get to it. I didn't complete it in January, but I will be finishing it very soon. The other book on my TBR that I didn't get to was Chlorine by Jade Song. This was supposed to be in my booktubers video, but I had so many books in that video, I realized that this would actually better fit into a different video. All of the other books on my TBR, which I think was like 5 or 6, I did read in January. So with that, let's now chat about all of the books that I read last month. Firstly, let's get the DNFs out of the way. All of these books were part of my Reading Booktubers Favorites video, so if you want to know more about why I didn't like these, you can find out more in the video in the cards above. I suppose one thing I can say is that I don't think any of these are terrible books. I wouldn't dissuade you from reading any if you're interested in them, but for a variety of reasons, they just weren't for me, and I knew I wasn't going to enjoy them. So I stopped. So of the books that I finished, my least favorite was definitely A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. To me, there was just some really clumsy, clunky elements to do with colonization and some of the like feminist themes that were being explored. I thought the atmosphere was great, and I can totally understand why a lot of people really identify and connected with Effie. But at the end of the day, I was left hugely disappointed by this book, and I can't see myself picking up another book by this author anytime soon. My second least favorite book of the month was Amina Al-Sarafi. This is one of those books that I totally get why people love it. It just wasn't for me. Fast-paced, questy, kind of adventure fantasy. I just think I need to stop picking it up. Which means all of the other books that I read, I, at the very least, had a good time with. I should have stacked these the other way so I could go in reverse order. Last night, the 31st of January, I just felt like kind of pumping out a small book for a bit of entertainment, so I picked out Miss Franny Fisher Investigates. This is the first in the Franny Fisher mysteries by Kerry Greenwood. I think the Australian title of this is The Cocaine Blues, but I bought the first 5 books in this series secondhand, so I'm guessing I must have got the UK editions. It was first published in the late 80s, and basically we follow Franny Fisher, who is like a reluctant socialite. Basically, she was born quite poor, but she inherited a bunch of money, and she travels to Melbourne to investigate some unusual circumstances around a wealthy young woman, only to uncover a whole host of other underbelly activity in Melbourne. It's very dialogue heavy, and although it's set in Melbourne, and so, you know, there's references to streets and places that I know and that I'm familiar with, there wasn't really any evocative description of the city, which is something I was really hoping to get when I picked up this series. Like, obviously, having lived here for 12 years, I know Melbourne pretty well, but if you are not familiar with the city, like, there's nothing in here to evoke a sense of Melbourne, other than a couple of references to the Windsor Hotel or to Swanston Street. There was definitely some dated elements to this, but the character Franny Fisher herself, I really liked her. She basically gives no fucks, and while she is obviously part of high society due to her wealth, she doesn't really take too many of their mores too seriously, and she's just very matter-of-fact and quite funny. So I don't think that this is a great book, but I had a good time, and I do want to continue in the series, at least for the next few books, and see how it goes. Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia and Dropbear are 2 books that I prioritised this year so that I could add some new books to recommend to you in the lead up to Invasion Day. Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia is a collection of a whole host of different people's experience growing up Aboriginal in Australia. A lot of them talk about their sense of identity, their sense of connection to community, racism that they experience. I will say that of the Growing Up series that I've read, I do feel like this is probably the weakest in terms of how it's being collated. The entries are great, and I highly recommend reading it, but they're all just kind of put in alphabetical order, I think, from the author's surname. There's no thoughtful rhyme or reason as to how the book was structured or how the essays are presented. I think it's still a highly valuable book, and I do definitely recommend it. But having read a couple of the books in this series, my favorite probably is still Growing Up African in Australia, and I just felt like there was so much intention put into not only which entries would be selected to be published in the collection, but also like how they were presented. Instead, it feels like here Anita Heiss just kind of like took the essays that she resonated with and that she liked the most and just put them in alphabetical order. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in terms of like the book, the reading experience from start to finish, it wasn't my favorite in the series, but I still am so glad that I read it. I also read If You Could See the Sun by Ann Liang, which won the Readings YA prize last year. It's quite an unusual and unique YA story, so I can definitely appreciate why it was selected as a winner. It's well written, and there's like a romance element, there's a speculative element, and there's also like sort of this mystery, almost thriller element too. There's a lot going on. Basically, we're following Alice, who is a teenage girl who is attending a very prestigious international school. It's a boarding school in Beijing, and Alice is hugely ambitious. So even though her parents do not have the wealth and the means that most of her cohort do, she's managed to secure a scholarship that pays for most but not all of her tuition. But one day when her parents reveal that they are not going to be able to continue to support her at this boarding school and that she's going to have to leave, Alice kind of freaks out and thinks that her whole future is ruined. But then she discovers that she can turn invisible, and of course she decides that she's going to make the most of this and monetize this new skill that she has. And so she sets out completing tasks for money. It might be spying on somebody who somebody thinks is cheating. It might be stealing the answers to the next test. And so she's making some really good money doing this, but the tasks and the requests just keep getting more and more intense. But the money that she can make keeps increasing too. It's a really interesting book about identity and also like the lengths we will go to, and it's also a pretty surface level, but it's their exploration of class as well. I liked a lot about it. I'm really glad I finally got to it. Then 3 more books that I read for my BookTubers favorites video were Minor Detail, As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow, and The Girl Who Drank the Moon. I liked all of these, but I will direct you to that video if you want to hear me talk about them more. Then 2 books that I read in my most recent Palestinian reading vlog was Water and Salt, which was a poetry collection. I really liked this. And A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Run, which I had mixed feelings about, but I am really glad that I read. It's really powerful, really intense, and gave me a lot to think about. The book that I reread this month was Squire. This is a graphic novel, and I had originally read a proof copy that I got through work, and I decided to finally pick up a finished copy so that I could read it in full color, in all its glory. And I liked it just as much the second time around. Then 2 books that I haven't spoken about yet is Into the Riverlands by Nghi. This is the 3rd book in the Singing Hill cycle. I loved it. I don't know that it was my favorite in the series, but I had a really good time. I'm already feeling like I want to reread this series. There's something about it that's just so comforting and warm. I love Chi. I can't wait for the 4th book to come out, and then maybe sometime later this year I might do a reread. Then another book that I already know I want to reread is The Mimicking of Known Successes by Malka, and this is like a sci-fi mystery romance. When I first read this book, I didn't own the physical copy. I just had the audiobook out at my library, and I had a really good time listening to it, but immediately I was like, I want to actually read it for myself. Then some more books that were in my booktubers favorites video. We have a memoir, Strong Female Character. I liked this a lot. Of the books that I didn't describe as new favorites, this was the one that I liked the most, if that makes sense. The Last Cuentista quickly became a new favorite middle grade for me. My favorite graphic novels of the month were absolutely Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch. Just adored these. So cute, so wholesome. If you're a fan of Kay O'Neill, The Tea Dragon Society, you need to try these out. Then my absolute 2 favorite books of the month by a country mile, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, is Dear Son by Thomas Mayer. This is a collection of 12 letters by Indigenous men to their fathers or to their sons, exploring masculinity. And there was just so much strength and vulnerability and tenderness and love in this book. It's going to be one of my favorite books of the year. It's one of my favorite non-fictions that I've ever read. I adored it. I spoke more about this in my Indigenous book recommendations, so make sure you check that one out if you haven't already. And my favorite fiction book of the month, again by a country mile, was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. I adored this. This was definitely my favorite book that I read reading booktubers favorites. And honestly, I feel like I found a new favorite book. I have read 2 Ishiguro books before. I've read Remains of the Day, which I did really enjoy. And I've also read The Buried Giant, which I didn't like at all, but I've had a couple of you tell me that I need to read Never Let Me Go because there's kind of some similarities between this and that book. So don't you worry, I'm bumping it up on my TBR and I hope to get to it soon. I'm obsessed with this book. I loved it so much. So as you can see, this has been a very successful reading month for me. Not only did I read a lot of books, I also enjoyed the vast majority of them. So I'm feeling chuffed about my reading trajectory for 2024. And with all of that said, I think now is the perfect time to head over to my shelf and chat about what we've got coming up in February. Okay, so I have my trusty little agenda with my video plans all scheduled out on their little tabs so that I can move them around, which I inevitably do. After I'm done with the video, I do write it in pen, which like I need to do for my booktubers video. But until they're done, I leave them on little sticky notes so that I can move them around because I do that all the time. Everything for February is currently on sticky notes, and I have 2 reading vlogs that I'm hoping to, film and get out to you in February, along with a couple of other videos, including a recommendations video. But as always, as a disabled person, I've learned that I need to be flexible with myself. So I never really feel quite confident to tell you which videos are coming when, but what I think we can do is put together at least like a partial TBR of some of the books that I'm hoping to get to. So let's start first with the book I know I need to read in February. And that is The Miracles of the Namiya General Store by Kaigu Higashino. I love this cover, and this, I'm so excited to say, is going to be my Blossom Book Club book for February. So we're going to be reading this together and I cannot wait. So that's the first book going on the TBR, which we will sit, where will we sit it? Just here for now? We'll just sit it here. These next 3 books, I feel like you should probably be able to guess what video they're going to be for. There's definitely a theme. The first one is Vampires of El Norte. I cannot wait. I've been desperate to get my hands on this. I know that people are having very mixed results with this book, but I don't know. Just like hearing some people talk about it, I just am salivating to get to it. So I'm very excited. We're going to read it in February. Next up, we have Love in the Big City. This is by Sang Young Park. This was translated by Anton Her, and it's a literary novel about a gay man searching for happiness in the lonely city of Seoul. I've heard good things. I can't wait. And then the third one, where are you? Is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This book came up in a lot of people's favorites, but that is not why we're reading it in February. This is a contemporary romance with like a little bit of a speculative element, and I haven't really read any like true romance, like genre romance in quite a while. So I have no idea how I'm gonna like respond to this, but I'm looking forward to giving it a go. Okay, so next on our TBR for a completely different video, we'll start with one of the books that I said I was gonna read last month, but we're rolling over to a different concept to a different month. It's Chlorine by Jade Song. I really mean it when I say I intend to read it in February. A horror coming of age novel. I'm looking forward to it. I didn't not read that because I wasn't interested in it. I had too many books already in my booktubers favorites video. I think we read, or at least tried to read, 14 books, which is a lot for me. I'm not Kayla. I can't do that on a regular basis. Between 3 and 6 books is usually a good number for me in terms of reading vlogs. Every now and then it is fun to do one with more books, but 14? That was a lot. That was excessive, let's be honest. But I really liked that video. I did have fun making it, and I hope you liked it too. But anyway, we're talking about my TBR. Oh, this next one. This one, I don't even know. I hadn't heard of it except from one person. The Very Nice Box by Laura Blackett and Eve Glackman. And I did manage to find a secondhand copy of this hardback because I love this cover so much more than I liked the paperback cover. A quirky, deeply satisfying, whip-smart debut. And I think this is some satire about what it's like to be alive in the 21st century and how messy and weird that is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, we have 6. What else do I want to tell you about? What about some non-fiction? There is a non-fiction that I have on my list for a video, but now that I own it, like, it is a pretty chunky non-fiction book, and I almost wonder like if just including it in a video with a bunch of other books will really be doing it justice. But it's on my list and I am hoping to get to it in February. It's Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. I have heard really good things about this book, and I was interested in it vaguely when it was first released, but I don't think I've ever read a book by Naomi Klein. I've read bits and pieces of like articles and stuff, but never a book. Now, like I said, it's chunky and obviously it's non-fiction. It's gonna be, you know, a bit more dense than our cutesy little romance or something. So if I had to place my bets on any book not getting read this month, it might be this one. But we'll see how we go. Should I tell you about one more? Yeah, why not? Let me tell you about one more. Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. This has been a favorite for a lot of people. All I know is that it's horror about beauty and the beauty industry and beauty ideals. I have not read a lot of horror. I've read little bits and pieces, but I would say the most horror book I've ever read is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado, which I loved. But I honestly haven't scoped out the waters as far as horror is concerned as a genre. So I have no idea what to expect, but I just kept hearing such good things that I couldn't help it. So that one's going on the list as well. And then obviously we do also have Light in Gaza, which I need to finish. And then I have learnt my lesson. I'm not going to add new releases to my to be read because I mean, Australian publication dates, they can change, and sometimes I've actually forgotten to check the Australian one and I'm actually have written down the American one. And also I am just somebody who takes a while to get to the books once I've bought them, more often than not. But the 3 books that I have written down that are coming out in February, or at least have a publication date somewhere in the world in February, is The Tainted Cup, which I honestly don't think I should be picking up because it is by Robert Jackson Bennett. And I have the first book in another one of his series and I haven't read it yet. So while I am interested in it, and honestly it sounds probably more interesting to me in terms of concept than I think this one does, I already bought this one. So I'm not going to let myself buy a new Robert Jackson Bennett until I've at least tried this one out. The book that I'm probably most likely to pick up, and the one that I'm most excited about though, is A Tempest of Tea. I love the cover of this one, but it is also historical fantasy, which we know is kind of my thing. It's also listed as paranormal and romance, which are subgenres that I can have a really good time with. And then on top of that, it is also listed as young adult. So that means it's just research for my job, right? I was interested in it before I knew it was YA, but now I'm you know, using my job as a children's bookseller to justify my book buying habit. It's fine. And then the other book that I did write down at the beginning of the year that does look interesting is The Foxwife. This one is also historical fantasy with a mystery element. It's an adult book though, which does all appeal to me. I think this is one that I'll just kind of wait and see how people are responding to it over the next month or two. And that will help me decide whether I want to, you know, go ahead and make a purchase myself. For now, I think the book that I'm most likely to pick up is definitely A Tempest of Tea. There's something about it, man. I have high hopes, but we're not going to add it officially to the TBR for February. Anyway, those are my most anticipated releases. We've just got 3 and we're trying to be a bit more reasonable and calm and see how things go before we buy books for no reason. But these books are my priority TBR for February. Feel free to leave guesses in the comments below as to what reading vlogs you think I'm doing based on the books that I told you about. And as we saw, I do tend to read more than this each month, but I like goals to be achievable, and so that is the approach we're taking here. Let me know if you're enjoying these kind of joint wrap-up TBR, anticipated releases, reset videos that we've got going at the moment. And please let me know what you're planning to read in February. A big thank you as always goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thank you for watching. I will talk to you again soon in another video, and until then, happy reading. Bye!